Hi there, welcome to the archives. So, this episode is called What Are the Lashes Doing? I tried to put glasses on, but then it was hitting up against. Featuring Jenny. Okay, so hi, welcome to the archives. This episode, I'm trying to do it so the cat, you can see the cutest cat ever. This one is called Drifting Out of Shame. Drifting Out of Solidarity and Into Shame. So Octavia Butler has a short story that's called The Evening, the Morning, and the Night. I'm using it to work on a chapter in a upcoming book, but I already posted this episode. No, not this episode. I already posted this blog on the blog. Does that make sense? What I'm about to read was a previous blog post that I took down that I'm going to relaunch because I'm doing an audio and a video recording. So that's why I'm posting this again. But it's not completely finished. I'm going to share the parts that I have that I already was working on that I do have written. And so let's start. So Octavia Butler's The Morning, the Evening, the Night tells the story of Lynn Mortimer and Alan Chi. So Lynn and Alan are two black African-American college students. They're both attending the University of Southern California. Again, this is a fiction, so it's not a true story, but it's a short fiction story that Octavia Butler wrote. The two of them, they're roommates. They're also dating, so they're lovers. They both have a rare congenital condition called Duryea-Gode Disease, also known as DGD. And this causes individuals to self-harm through self-sabotage, self-mutilation, or suicide at some point and to some degree. So violence is, they often face a lot of violence, and violence against them is said to be, no, they often will engage in a lot of violence in the novel, right? So when they are violent or they're known to obviously like self-mutilate, all of that, it's said to be a result of their drifting. Now, in the novel, drifting is a state in which the individual with DGD, this is a quote, they went off into a world of their own and stopped responding to their surroundings. You can find that on page 406. So we can think of drifting as a state of intense affect. I did a post on affect, a previous blog. But it's just when you're really overstimulated, your nervous system is all off, right? And this is often accompanied, you can think of it as like trauma, especially for those who live with like post-traumatic stress. Others have written about how there's nothing post about it. It's still very much, something that we are in. So it causes dissociation, an overactive sympathetic nervous system, overwhelming stress, or high cortisol levels of some sort, right? And this is often due to like a fight or flight response. So we can think of drifting and DGDs as mental illnesses such as depression, borderline, narcissistic personality, schizophrenia, bipolar, or variations of the autism spectrum, or other forms of neurodivergent ways of being, right? So drifting is said to is used to construct the entire DGD community as violent. So they're all seen as violent people, and this is used to justify violence, stigma, discrimination, and Satanism against them, right? Which then really affects their ways of living and how they move through the world. And so in the novel, Lynn and Alan, they're described as stereotypical terms, right? They're brilliant students, are unable to regulate their emotions or manage their day-to-day lives without constant supervision or surveillance. They require a really strict diet to maintain any semblance of normalcy. And so in the book, biscuits are what are used to quote unquote control them. So as controlled DGDs, because not all of them are quote unquote controllable, right? So these ones are seen as like quote unquote, like you would consider them to be like high functioning, right? Although that's technically not a great term. They're able to mask. They're, because of the biscuits, they can live day-to-day lives. They can be students. They can go about without being institutionalized. So that's kind of what, when I say controlled, it's a term that's used in the actual story, but that's a context. It's like they're not as bad as others. And so they find themselves in a relationship, which is an ironic twist of fate because they both blame their parents for their status as double DGDs. So not only are they born with DGDs, but there's an added complication because they are seen as double, like hyper, which means that both sets of their parents pass down the traits. So both of Alan's parents had DGD, both of Lynn's parents had DGD, and then both sets of parents passed it down to each of them, right? And so what happens in the story is there's a prescription drug that people use, and this is said to be what causes their condition. And so their parents, before they conceived them, their parents were using the drugs, and then they themselves also had DGD, so then they gave birth to Alan and Lynn. Both of them blame their parents for it, and yet they're now in a similar relationship. And I've seen, we can often think of this, for instance, as sickle cell, for instance, right? Where both parents, I know sometimes where folks who both partners are dating each other, they both have sickle cell anemia, and then they're considering having children and what that means if their child was born with sickle cell as well. So this is similar where both of them are dating, they both have the same condition. If they have children, it's very likely that their children will also have the same condition as well because it's hereditary. And so before they met, Lynn had never met anybody else that was a double DGD before, right? And so as they consider marriage, they want to figure out, is this something that they want to do? Do you want to have kids? Will we be okay if our kids have it? And so they go visit Alan's mother, who is institutionalized. Remember, Alan's mother also has DGD, and so she's in an institution. You could think of that as like a mental institute, right? Like think of it as like CAMH or the Royal in Ottawa. So they're going to DILG, which is an institution, and it's run by other controlled DGDs. Okay, and this is where anybody who has DGD, they're sent there to discipline. Their treatment is also rehabilitation center. Octavia Butler writes, a retreat, you send your out-of-control DGD relatives. So Lynn's parents had sent her there when she was a child as a wake-up call, when she was younger. And in the story, she tried to kill herself, right? And so she doesn't have the best experience with this place. And even still, she decides she's going to join Alan, and they're going to go to the center and visit his mom. So when they go there, they run into a doctor, Dr. Beatrice Alcantara, and she's the second double DGD that Lynn has ever met. So Alan is the first one she's ever met. This is the second person she's ever met, and this is a woman. So she's never run into somebody with a condition that is also a woman. So Dr. Beatrice is 60. She's one of the first double DGDs to ever be born, and she's one of the oldest to be still alive. And Lynn writes, I looked at Beatrice and I couldn't see anything to smile about. As we introduced ourselves, I realized I didn't like her. I couldn't see any reason for that either. But my feelings were my feelings. I didn't like her. And at one point, Beatrice reaches over for Lynn, and Lynn just like recoils and kind of, like that disgusted kind of a thing. She said, I backed away from her out of reach, repelled by her touch. So when Beatrice finally does make contact with Lynn, her reaction is visceral. Octavia Butler writes, I jerked away reflexively. By the time I caught myself, I had swung around as though I meant to hit her. How? I did mean to hit her, but I stopped myself in time. So for Beatrice, the same feeling. She's not feeling it either. Like the feelings are mutual, right? So she tells Lynn, people like us don't get along well. You must realize I don't like you any more than you like me. We seem, she says, to be very territorial. Dilg is a haven for me when I'm the only one of my kind here. When I'm not, it's a prison. So she's basically saying when other people like me, my kind, a double DGD, is here, it feels like hell. Um, and to which Lynn says, I swallowed, saw her through a kind of haze for a moment. I hated her mindlessly for just a moment. So the two are obviously unable to get along. They have clear language to articulate the rupture. I don't like her. We find the unconscious. There's this thing that's happening where no one really knows what's it's just like this affective thing. They've never met each other before. For whatever reason, they just do not vibe. They're just not jiving. There's visceral body language. There's moving back. She wants to hit her. But my feelings are my feelings. They know for a fact I do not like you, and for whatever reason, I don't like you. So as they're leaving, Lynn is unable to look back. She's like, I'm not having it. I couldn't look back at her until we were all well away from the house. Until we left the guard at the gate and gone off the property, I couldn't make myself look back. At the very last sentence of the story, she writes, for long, irrational minutes, I was convinced that somehow, if I turned, I would see myself standing there, gray and old, growing small in the distance, vanishing. Lynn is left stunned as to why or how she even had any dislike or why she felt threatened for Beatrice. What invisible force would have been so powerful that it propelled the two away from one another? So sometimes, have you ever had this experience where you meet somebody and the vibes are just off? Again, I did my last blog was on affect, but this was kind of the theme where things just happen. You have no real language for it. Just for some reason, it's just not clicking, right? Because I study emotions, I'm really interested here in mapping out what emotions was also in the room when the two of them met. Right? Because I specifically look at shame right now, I'm interested in how shame was getting in the way of the two, based on them being framed as double DGDs, right? So you have to recognize their condition is framed by society as something that's shameful. They, as women with double DGDs, not only do they just have DGD, I can't even say that word if I say it one more time. Not only do they just have it, but they have this amplified condition, right? They are seen as violent. This is the second person Lynn has ever met, so there's already this lack of trust. And so I'm interested in knowing what is shame doing here. In a different blog, I'll get a little bit more into it because this is a chapter from an upcoming book. I'm still mapping it out, but I'm really interested in what happens when shame gets in the way. Because what I'm learning is if there's any element of shame for whatever reason, this is not to say that they themselves are ashamed or, they see themselves as shame. But when shame shows up in the room, we are likely, at this point, there's going to be rupture. If you don't know what to look for, if you are a person who can't admit that you are in shame, if you can't face the fact that shame is something that will circulate in and around you, if you are already not having conversations around shame, and then it shows up in your relationship with somebody else, the chances are it's gonna cause a splinter. There's gonna be rupture. The relationship is likely not going to last. It's not going to be sustainable because that's not the nature of shame. The nature of shame is to isolate, is to drive us away from one another, it's to cause us to perform. Shame leads us to hide or to cover up things. We may, like I just said, we may lie because we're we're ashamed to tell the truth. In shame, we're going to put on a mask and pretend to be something we're not just because we are afraid to be vulnerable with the other person. We will get nasty with one another. So shame often leads into control dynamics, which I've talked about plenty times before. And in my research, I'm not the only one. It's in the literature, right? Shame is all about control. Shame is all about control and power. And so if you feel ashamed and now you're in a relationship with somebody else, likely you're going to do a lot of things to weaponize emotions or manipulation, right? And so what happens in this case is, in order to not face your own shame, you have to make the other person wrong. You have to make the other person bad, because then that positions you as somebody who is good and right, right? If there's shame that's showing up and you're having a difficult time with addressing that shame, you're not going to want to look at yourself. You're not going to be accountable, because in shame you cannot be accountable. I'm not the only one who's talked about it. Barnard College, they had a session that looked at this, right? How shame gets in the way of accountability. It's very hard to be accountable if you're already in deep shame. I've experienced this myself. When I was most deeply in shame, I could not be accountable to anybody. I've written about this. I was the most narcissistic when I was in deep shame, because I had to like hyper perform as like, I'm superior, I'm better than you. Narcissism is about deep internalized shame. And so I'm interested in, where is shame showing up between Beatrice and Lynn, right? Whether they know it or not. That's not how shame works. Just because you acknowledge that you're ashamed or shame is there doesn't mean that like, oh, now it's here. Even when you don't acknowledge shame, it's still going to show up. And so I'm going to get into this in a future blog, but I'm just trying to frame what Octavia Butler is doing here is actually very brilliant, right? DGD, we can look at that as different forms of mental illness, as different forms of what happens when we're like highly traumatized, when we're triggered, when we're manic, when we're in crisis, when we're in episodes. The drifting, this whole idea of drifting is also a very Caribbean word, right? If you listen to Soca, they talk about drifting, a lot of like madness, that kind of an idea, that is going to bring some level of, it's a conversation about shame. Again, not to say that the individual is or should be framed as shameful. That's a completely different conversation. What I'm talking about here is when things precede us, right? The emotion shows up before we even get there. Or we don't even know that we're necessarily in it. And then we meet another person who then reminds us of this thing that we refuse to look at. So for Lynn in the story, she has a hard time dealing with her diagnosis, right? She's struggling again because a lot of the symptoms are tied to self-harm, self-hate, self-mutilation. She's struggling with, quote unquote, loving herself, whatever that looks like, however that means to us, right? She's having a really hard time with accepting herself as a double DGD. Now she meets another individual who's older than her, who's a doctor, who's doing well and living with this condition. It all of a sudden has disrupted her. For whatever reason, she thinks she doesn't know why she doesn't like her. But often what happens is if we are struggling to accept parts of ourselves, at least I'll speak for myself. In those moments where I'm having a really hard time loving all the parts of me, when I see somebody else or when somebody else shows up who looks exactly like those parts of me that I don't want to face, chances are I'm not going to like that person. Because I don't already like that person in me. Right? I don't even fuck with that version of me. I'm not messing with that within me. So why am I going to accept that in somebody else? Again, I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but I'm playing around with these ideas, right? Thinking through the psychology of this. What does that look like when you meet somebody else? Again, there's also intuition. Sometimes we just meet people where it's just not vibing and we're not clicking, and that's okay, right? That's also completely okay. That's a different conversation. And we need to trust that. And I actually think that these two need to trust each other. And in the next episode, I'll get more into actually what's happening here. Because what Octavia Butler does is actually very brilliant. And it's a chemical. So there's a chemical that's happening that's invisible. They can't smell it. You can't taste it. They don't know what's happening. But there's a chemical that's getting in the way. And in the chapter, I'm interested in mapping this chemical out as emotions, as shame specifically, as fear, right? Because emotions are not something you can smell, you cannot see them, but they're there. They're circulating in the environment. They're objects, like Sarah Ahmed says. And so maybe in the next blog post, I might just do that right away just to get in it, and then I'll post it one after the other. But that's what we're looking at, is how emotions will show up sometimes and then cause us to drift apart from one another. So if this resonates, please pass it along, like, share, subscribe. If it's not for you, that's okay, right? My words are not meant for everybody, and that's okay as well too. So in the next one, I'll get more into Lynn and Beatrice in solidarity. Until next time, in solidarity.